Welcome to this session on how to define a cyber risk appetite that actually works, as opposed perhaps to what I commonly see used in the industry. Now, risk appetite is something that the phrase is used a lot within the industry, and it means many different things to many different people, which is one of the problems with how it's used today is that lack of consistency. But even when I see it being defined for organizations, I almost never see it being used to drive decisions in any real sense. More often than not, it feels like a box organizations have checked. Yes, we have a risk appetite. And that's where it sits on the shelf until the next audit or the next compliance review, those sorts of things. So my intent here is to share what I call a working risk appetite, something that can actively drive decisions within an organization and make a difference. So with that set up, let's get into this. We'll talk about appetite versus tolerance and the differences I see it. Why bother to have an appetite in the first place? How can you use it, if you will? I'll talk about some of the risk appetites that I see out there that I think are particularly problematic before I get into my idea of a working risk appetite. And then I'll talk about, having defined a working risk appetite, what are the kinds of things you have to do to become aligned with that, and then stay aligned with it, which is a different problem altogether. And assuming any of that makes sense to you and you think might be valuable, I'll talk about some steps maybe you could take back to your organization to start down this path of developing a risk appetite that works for your organization. So appetite versus tolerance, what's the difference? Well, again, I think within the profession, very often these words are used interchangeably, but they don't mean the same thing to me, and let me explain that. The appetite is the line in the sand. It is this objective from a risk or a loss exposure perspective. We want to manage up to this, but no farther, maybe unless extreme circumstances exist. And then tolerance is this band, maybe a little above it and certainly below it, in which the organization is willing to have some flexibility. And you have to have that line in the sand before you can really begin to manage around it, all right? Before you can actually implement or define or implement some sort of tolerance and then affect people's behaviors and whatnot to operate within those bands. So why bother? Well, an appetite, a well-defined appetite, can provide a lot of clarity in terms of how management wants the people in the organization to operate, right? How it should affect decisions, both in terms of reducing risk or exposing the organization to more risk because of opportunities, these sorts of things. It can help improve focus and risk management efforts, really identify the things that matter most from a risk management perspective, which is, I think, a huge problem in the industry today. Communication with stakeholders, which is another huge problem. And we'll look at a specific example of how the appetite, the approach I'm going to be sharing with you, can be used to communicate with management. But again, this is something that I think the risk management profession struggles with significantly. And of course, bottom line, reduce the probability of the organization experiencing a particularly severe event. But we have to, if we're going to define or operate under this notion of unacceptable loss, we have to define what that looks like. So before we do any of that, let's look at some of the risk appetites that I see out there in the industry that I believe are problematic. And the first one is something like this, where an organization says it has zero appetite for loss of customer data or for some sort of outage, these sorts of things. And this is at best naive to think that they have a zero appetite, because if they have customer data they have an appetite for risk. The only way to have zero appetite is to not have any customer data, arguably not have any customers. So this is problematic. And the criteria I've used for evaluating risk appetites, is it realistic and actionable? Does it provide clarity, et cetera, et cetera. And this appetite statement fails on the first step, right? It's not realistic, it's not actionable. So at best, it's useless. At worst, I think it might actually increase an organization's liability, because by defining this, by having a risk appetite statement like this, they have guaranteed non-compliance. They have ensured that at no point in their existence will they actually be anywhere close to what they've defined as an appetite. So, at worst, if I were a regulator or a lawyer in a post-event, post-breach sort of scenario, and I saw this was an organization's risk appetite, I would use it against them all day long. I would say, clearly, this, having this risk appetite demonstrates a complete lack of understanding of risk management. So, maybe that's just me. Slightly better, an incremental improvement is low appetite. Without that being really clearly defined, what we mean by low, it fails the second step. It doesn't provide clarity. Is it realistic? Arguably. Is it actionable? Maybe, depending on the circumstance, but it certainly isn't clear. So again, if clarity and expectations is one of the criteria for risk appetite, and I believe it should be, then this fails on that step. I also see some few organizations define their risk appetites in economic terms, like we don't want to exceed $10 million in loss. And this can work. I've seen this work, but I believe it's a harder path than the approach I'll be sharing with you. And there are some maybe subtle things that have to be worked out, have to be defined and settled on in these kinds of risk appetite statements, such as, are we talking about $10 million in a single event or an aggregate across multiple events? So again, the bottom line is that this can work, but I believe it's more difficult than what I'll show you next. So what's my notion of a working risk appetite? Well, the first step is to choose a risk. And in my terms, when you think about risk as I see it at least, what we're trying to manage is loss event scenarios, the frequency and magnitude of loss event scenarios. So these loss event scenarios are the risks that we're trying to manage and that we need to set an appetite for. So for example, disclosure of customer PII records. That is a loss event scenario that we can evaluate in terms of the probability and magnitude of these kinds of events. Likewise, business process outages or regulatory noncompliance events, financial misstatements, etc. So it's these loss event scenarios that are our risks and that we need to set an appetite for. And what this means, however, when you look at it this way, is that you may define multiple risk appetites for your organization. And I believe, on the surface, your reaction might be, it's hard enough to define one that people agree to. And you want us to define multiple? Well, believe it or not, I believe the approach I'll be sharing with you today is actually easier because you'll be defining it for these different, very specific loss event scenarios. So you judge after I've shared. For our example today, in the next few slides, we'll select this risk as where what we'll define an appetite for. So that's our first step. Choose a loss event scenario, a risk, to define an appetite for. The second step is define a loss magnitude threshold, and not in dollars and cents. Okay. Now you can, but again, for this example at least, bear with me, we're just going to define it as number of compromised records. And we're going to, for this example, choose 1 million records. We want no more than that should probably be no disclosure of greater than or equal to 1 million customer PII records. Why 1 million records? Well, for a couple of reasons. One is it reduces the number of assets, systems, databases, and whatnot that are crown jewels within the context of this threshold. So if we think of crown jewels as those things that expose us to a loss greater than or equal to this threshold, those are our crown jewels. From a practical management perspective, we want as few of those crown jewels in our risk landscape as possible. As certainly for starting out in applying something like this, you don't want to become too aspirational. So by selecting 1 million records, there are fewer systems, assets, or databases and applications and whatnot that would expose us to that size loss. So fewer crown jewels to worry about. And you'll see why that's important here shortly. Also, millions of records as a breach in the headline has a bigger sting to it than thousands of records. So again, just a couple of reasons. You might have additional reasons for choosing whatever threshold that you want to choose. And something like this is there's nothing magic about 1 million records. If you have a database with 999,000 records in it, do you want to treat that as a crown jewel? Probably. Okay. Maybe you can say if it's within some range of this number, 1 million records, we're going to treat it as a crown jewel. Again, there's flexibility here. This is just an example, but you'll see as we go along why it's important to draw a line somewhere. And keep in mind that there might be discomfort around 1 million records. Maybe it should be 100,000. You can get to that, right? Let's get it right at 1 million records. And then once we've nailed that, once we've become good at managing around that threshold, then we can lower our thresholds and become more aggressive in our risk management, if that makes sense. But don't get too aggressive out of the gate with something like this. I think that's a recipe for more challenge and pain than is necessary. The next step is to define a probability threshold for an event of that size. Right? So let's say we've said, we've drawn that magnitude line at 1 million records. I want, let's say I'm on the board or I'm the CEO, and I want the probability of event like of compromise of that nature to be less than 5% within the next 12 months. Do whatever's necessary to make sure that we're sub 5% probability of that event occurring on those crown jewels within the next 12 months. So simple enough. However, some organizations, I can easily imagine, will push back and say, it's quantitative. That's really hard. We're not ready to be quantitative from a probability perspective. Okay. You can define your qualitative threshold as very low, but, oops, shoot. But then you still have to define what that means. What criteria have to be met for you to feel comfortable that you are in that very low state? So let's look at an example of that. And again, since we're talking about the probability of the event occurring, we have to look at two categories of characteristics: the threat landscape and your preventative control conditions. So again, using our example, we identified our crown jewels as being those that expose us to this size breach. We're going to say those systems, those crown jewels, and the privileged systems that access them. And by privileged systems, I'm talking about in the DBAs and the network administrators or the developers that have direct access to those crown jewels, privileged access to those crown jewels. We're going to treat those as if their endpoints, their systems, as if they are crown jewels also. So those crown jewels and the privileged systems that access them that are directly internet facing, they're in a more active threat landscape. We're going to say as a condition for being very low probability that no more than one exploitable condition on those systems every 3 years. And again, there's a description of what I mean by exploitable condition. Those are not your everyday vulnerabilities. These are the things that give the bad actors direct ability to achieve the compromise, if you will. And furthermore, not only do we want those exploitable conditions to be really uncommon, no more than once every 3 years, when they occur, they have to be discoverable and remedied within 48 hours. And what this means by setting those criteria, we also then have to have the policies and processes and maybe technologies that are in place to achieve that, both in terms of preventing those exploitable conditions from existing and for discovering and remedying them. If we have these things in place that allow us to achieve these criteria, then we can say, all right, we're comfortable saying that for those internet-facing crown jewels and privileged systems, we have a very low probability of compromise. For those crown jewels and privileged systems that are not internet-facing, in other words, they're facing a less active threat landscape, we have similar criteria, but different in terms of the frequency of those exploitable conditions and how rapidly we have to identify and fix them. The bottom line is what I've done here is provided an example of the kinds of criteria you would have to define if you wanted to operate qualitatively, right, from a probability perspective. Now, just FYI, these criteria I arrived at quantitatively through some control analytics that I performed in the background that we don't have nearly enough time to get into. So even though you might use the words, qualitative terms like very low, in this case, if I were using those qualitative terms, the criteria underneath them are arrived at quantitatively. And in fact, given these criteria, I would have, meeting these criteria, I would have less than 5% probability of an event. So even though I'm not using the number 5%, right, I'm achieving it through these quantitative criteria. Bottom line is, given this approach, we've now arrived at a risk appetite for this risk, that disclosure of customer PI records. And it says less than 5% probability in the next 12 months of disclosure greater than or equal to 1 million customer PI records. Pretty straightforward. And it meets all of these criteria. It's realistic and actionable, as we'll see as we go along, provides all kinds of clarity and focus. And we'll see later how it can improve communication with the board of directors, et cetera. And ultimately, I would argue most importantly, it allows us to achieve that bottom line, which reduces the potential for these big, hairy, painful events. We could define similar sorts of appetite statements for outages or for regulatory compliance sorts of things and financial misstatements and so on. So this approach can work for any sort of loss event scenario you can think of, even outside of cyber. And again, the criteria, which we've already talked about, realistic and actionable, it's specific to a loss event scenario. It has that clearly defined severity threshold and probability threshold. So now that we've defined a risk appetite, well, now what? What do we do with that? Does it sit on the shelf again, or can we actually use it? So two things to focus on: getting aligned with the appetite that we've defined, and then staying aligned, which is a very different animal. Getting aligned really boils down to identify those crown jewels. And I know there are going to be organizations out there, or people in organizations who are thinking, we don't even know where all our data are. So I don't know what my crown jewels are. Okay, you know where some of them are. You know what some of your crown jewels are. Start there. Don't use the lack of perfect data to prevent you from making real progress on what you do know. Okay, so take what you do know about your risk landscape, the crown jewels you're aware of, and start there. And then have a side project for identifying additional crown jewels and having policies that say, hey, no more crown jewels. If you want to implement something that looks like this, well, that's a crown jewel. So that has to be reported to us, right? So put into place the kinds of policies and processes that allow you to, over time, gain better control over your crown jewels. And then once you've identified some of your crown jewels, if not all of them, evaluate that probability of exceeding the appetite's magnitude threshold. Look at the threat landscape they're existing in and the control conditions, the preventative control conditions around them, and say, are we meeting that probability threshold? And hopefully you are, but if you're not, you can identify specifically why you aren't and what your opportunities are for making improvements, and make those improvements. So let's look at an example. Let's say we've evaluated our risk landscape, and these are the crown jewels we've identified. And then the privilege systems that support them. Great, we have a starting point. We've taken that second step of identifying, or that third step of identifying the crown jewels. Now let's look for something easy, some easy opportunities to make improvements. For example, hey, let's not have crown jewels in the dev test environment. Let's create policies and processes around that to prevent those from existing. Removing the existing ones, trimming down the number of records in those environments so that they don't constitute that magnitude of loss. Removing old data dumps is another example of the kinds of steps you can take here. But then you have to look a little more closely. Which of these crown jewels are internet facing, identify and fix any exploitable conditions, and then look at those crown jewels that are not internet facing, have a less active threat landscape, and identify and fix those exploitable conditions. Those are the steps you can take to get an alignment. And that's, I would argue, probably the easier part of the problem. The more difficult part very often is going to be staying aligned. And there are really two dimensions to that. Setting these decision-making boundaries, you may have heard the phrase, you can't stop stupid. Maybe you can't stop it, you can decrease it, right? You can avoid some stupid stuff. And we'll look at some examples of that. And then establish some early warning indicators to help you recognize when things maybe are nearing the boundaries. So let's look at those decision-making boundaries, for example. And these are the kinds of things I would absolutely put into place if I was a CISO in an organization today. This would be one of my policies, guaranteed. I would stipulate 100% of the asset management information regarding crown jewels in my asset management database or my CMDB, whatever, all of that has to be accurate all of the time. Now, this is a great example of why we want the number of things we're going to consider crown jewels to be manageable, because this would be an insane requirement if you were to say all of our assets, all of the information has to be accurate all of the time. That's never going to happen. And it frankly doesn't need to happen from a risk management perspective, but it absolutely should be part of your policy around crown jewels. I can't think of a rational excuse or reason to not have this as a policy in an organization for the crown jewels. Another one, no crown jewels in dev test. There is absolutely no reason for dev test to expose the organization to, at any level, to a breach of that size. Maybe you could even say something like no third parties may have maybe a crown jewel, so to speak. And this one can be more challenging because maybe you've just outsourced certain business processes to a third party where they're a crown jewel. And that's okay. Maybe the policy isn't no third parties. Maybe it is third parties can only be crown jewels under certain circumstances and certain approval processes. The bottom line is you want to very closely manage any third parties that are or might become crown jewels. And you would also have policies around any changes to the crown jewel landscape in terms of additions. Would have to have very thorough review. And by the way, the people proposing them would have to understand that because this is a crown jewel, the standards around controls are very different, much more stringent. And so if there's a business need for another crown jewel, there's also then this business need for compliance with these additional standards, which we'll get into more about in a little bit. And then any policy exception requests related to crown jewels would have to have a very different sort of approval process than your normal policy exceptions. And it might even go to the very top of the organization. So again, these are the kinds of things that would be required in order to maintain compliance or alignment with the risk appetite, around these crown jewels. And then this last one, which is something I think a lot of organizations might not think about, is these personnel with privileged access and this much higher level of responsibility because of their access to crown jewels. They have different maybe hiring criteria, certainly education and certification criteria, and in the agreements that they might have to enter into with the organization, the certification, annual certifications and whatnot. And I've actually implemented that as a CISO, and it was very effective at helping to drive home to these people this higher level of responsibility and care that they have to align with. So then let's look at KRIs. And in my world, I think of KRIs in three buckets: threat-related KRIs, asset-related KRIs, and key controls. And so let's look at just, and this isn't a comprehensive list, this is just an example. Let's just look at those KRIs that are specific to crown jewels. And again, these are just examples. So for example, phishing attempts against those privileged personnel, if there's a significant increase in that, I want to know, maybe something's up. Maybe I need to add additional controls of some sort. Scans and probes of internet-facing crown jewels, if there's a significant increase there, I want to know about it. And certainly any illicit activity against crown jewels that are internal to the organization, that are not internet-facing, that absolutely needs to be recognized right away. Likewise, the assets themselves, the number of shadow IT environments that contain crown jewels should be zero. Again, this is something that shouldn't even require discussion. But unfortunately, I think there are certainly organizations where some shadow IT environments contain crown jewels, contain large volumes of sensitive information or are critical to business processing and that sort of thing. So, this is an example where you can draw this line in the sand and have a KRI where an evaluation of the shadow IT environment identifies, hey, there's a database here with over 1 million records. That's a violation of the KRI. Internet-facing crown jewels, again, this is something that should not increase over the current threshold. You probably, most organizations, I would imagine, would have to have one or more systems that represent crown jewels that are internet-facing. It's just the nature of business today. But that shouldn't increase without, again, all the right processes being followed and approvals being achieved. And another example of something I would aim for in an organization I was a CISO for or a risk manager for is legacy systems that are crown jewels. There should be none, because legacy systems typically are legacy because they can't be maintained at the same level of security that more up-to-date, more modern systems are capable. So again, this is something maybe your organization can't have zero here because you're still relying on legacy system for some key business process and so on. So maybe your number isn't zero, maybe it's 1, and you're always looking for opportunities to drive that to 0, but it sure shouldn't increase. And then key controls, again, these are the kinds of things that should be rhetorical, that should be obvious. But crown jewels with substandard security control, that should be 0. These are crown jewels. And here again, this is another example of why you don't want to be too aspirational in the thresholds you set for magnitude, because if you set it too low, the number of crown jewels in your environment will explode, which means you either can't comply with this, or you set these kinds of standards, so weak, if you will, the controls around this larger population of crown jewels to not be the kind of strength you need. So the point I'm making here is when you're starting out doing something like this, don't get too aggressive in the thresholds you set, because you have to insist on the controls around these crown jewels being exactly what they're supposed to be, really, really stringent. The number of people who have privileged access, this is something also that should be very closely tracked. And policy exceptions should be as close to 0 as possible, and would have to include some really significant reviews. And certainly that last one there about being unable to meet recovery requirements, if it's a crown jewel because of its importance to business process, there is no rational excuse I can imagine for not being able to meet the recovery requirements for it. So again, just examples of the kinds of KRIs you can define because of these thresholds that provide much better focus and much better ability to identify when things are out of alignment in a really important way. And from a KPI perspective, and my approach to KPIs are that they fall into 2 buckets. Those that speak to our ability to make well-informed decisions as an organization and our ability to execute reliably. And so if we look at decision support, again, specific to crown jewels, I already talked about that up-to-date criteria and the advanced controls monitoring. So if we're saying that these crown jewels, we have to be able to recognize as quickly as possible when controls are out of their intended state, and we have to be able to fix them as quickly as possible, then we have to have criteria or KPIs like this that say we have to have technologies and processes in place that allow us to know as quickly as possible when a crown jewel is at increased exposure, and likewise for threat activity. And when these conditions do occur, we need to be able to understand why. It isn't enough to know that they occurred, that these conditions occurred. We also have to know the root causes as to why. I can't afford to play whack-a-mole around crown jewels. I need to know why this variant state occurred and fix the root cause so that we minimize the probability of that happening again. And then in execution, a couple of simple examples are 100% of the security audit, et cetera, findings, deficiencies, if you will, they have to be closed on time, 100% of the time. This probably isn't reasonable if we were looking at all of the deficiencies across our organization. But around crown jewels, this is, again, something that I can't imagine a rational explanation for why this shouldn't be an expectation. Same thing for critical patch deployments. We should have, in my view, we should have very different patch requirements around crown jewels and those privileged systems around them than normal systems. And we need to hit that 100% of the time. Now on to that communication and board reporting and executive reporting that organizations very often struggle with. So let's say in our example that we've defined risk appetites for these top risks for our organization. And we've defined these magnitude thresholds and these probability thresholds for each of them. And we've gone out and we've evaluated our controls in the threat landscape, and we've said, okay, the first quarter, we weren't looking so good. But quarter over quarter, we were able to make improvements because, again, we defined these risk appetites and we evaluated the control deficiencies, the opportunities we had to make improvements, and we could strategize and plan to make improvements over time so that we could become aligned with our risk appetite. And this can be a really effective way to demonstrate progress relative to these thresholds that management has already, given their blessing to. And again, those probabilities are the probability of an event in the next 12 months. And as I said before, if you don't like numbers, if you want to go with qualitative terms, you can do that as long as you're very careful and very specific in what the criteria are for what very low means, etc. And the advantage to this, one of the huge advantages is just its explicit, how explicit it is, right? This risk appetite is crystal clear. And the things you have to do to align with it and stay aligned with it are also crystal clear. So the conversation changes, communication changes, the things you focus on and do tends to change, and it can have a significant effect on the organization's overall efficacy. So applying what you've learned. So hopefully what I've shared here makes sense. Even if it's just part of it makes sense, I'd be happy with that. But let's be optimistic and say that most, if not all of it, makes sense. What do you do with that now? So in the next week, you could go back to your organization and talk about your colleagues. Talk with your colleagues about this and brainstorm. Get their ideas, because what I've described almost certainly isn't going to be a perfect fit for your organization. But maybe it's close, and maybe there are some tweaks that through some conversations with your colleagues, you can come up with a version of this that is a good fit for your organization. And something else I've probably, is important to mention is that for some organizations, the word risk appetite or the term risk appetite might be so firmly ensconced and mean something so very different than what I've described that you'd be swimming upstream if you tried to introduce this as a risk appetite-driven approach. So maybe you choose a different term for this to avoid those religious debates. But keep in mind, at the end of the day, this is still risk appetite we're talking about. Right? It doesn't matter what you call it. So in the next 30 days, having done all that, then get some stakeholder support. Begin to share the ideas that you and your colleagues have come up with and propose, maybe even propose a hypothetical appetite for one of the more of the types of risk, and describe the benefits that the organization can gain from that in terms of better focus, better communication, and all the things that I've already talked about. And then in the next 90 days, having again done those previous steps, then choose one of those risks. And I would strongly suggest you only choose one. Start with one. Let's nail down one of our risks with an appetite before we get too aggressive or too optimistic in forging ahead. Choose one, hopefully one that management cares most about, because that's where you'll get the best support, and take the necessary first steps for that. Identify that initial appetite, the magnitude and the probability thresholds. And again, I can't say often enough, don't get too aggressive there, because you'll make the rest of the work unachievable or too painful. And then get aligned with that initial appetite, and then figure out how to stay aligned, necessary policies and processes and whatnot. And then once you've been successful at that, once you've shown how valuable that can be, then go on to the other risks that your organization faces. And again, once you've gotten good at this, by all means, lower those thresholds. Maybe it was uncomfortable to draw a line at 1 million records. Maybe you're really feeling like 500,000 would be better. Okay, go there after you've won the battles that you'll face in achieving alignment with risk appetite at that higher level of exposure. So hopefully you found some of what I've shared interesting and potentially useful. And I sincerely hope to hear from people with questions, which I will try to answer as quickly as I can. And again, I appreciate the time you spent